have interest rates bottomed? That is what we are discussing in this video. It's something I've never heard anybody else talk about. And I think it is something that is incredibly important if you're in your 20s, if you're in your 30s, even if you're in your 40s, to understand, because the next 40 years could be a different 40 years to the 40 years we've just seen and the 40 years that people have been schooled and educated to believe all the theory around. So I think this video is incredibly important. I've identified a massive pattern, I believe, and I believe it is very important to understand this. So before we get started, please like this video. It takes a lot of editing and work, and by liking this video, you're just doing your part. Please subscribe to the channel. That greatly helps the video. It greatly helps the channel. And without further ado, let's get to the whiteboard. Let's go. So have interest rates bottomed? That's what we're going through right now. So first of all, let's talk about the 40 years after 1940, going from 1940 to 1980, which we've got on this chart right here. And I'm calling that the inflationary era. It was an era where interest rates went up in a long-term trend. If you think about it, there were times when interest rates were coming down, but they were always to a higher low than previously, whereas in the MMT era, you've had the complete opposite of that happening. So let's talk about what happened. You basically had the Second World War, which led to a baby boom, which led to this inflationary era that we had throughout the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. And a lot of talk right now is comparing what we are seeing right now in inflation to that of the 1970s. So the interesting thing about that was you had similar policy mistakes made by central bankers back during this era as you're having gonna probably happen right now. And that is the really interesting thing. Let's talk about the MMT era, which runs from 1980 to 2020, which lines up perfectly for when interest rates went down to zero and things completely changed. And really, I think that was the bottom in interest rates, and we're gonna get to that in a minute. So basically, they took rates really high throughout the 70s and the 80s, and then they came down during the MMT era. They came down in a trend, and it's exactly like this trend that you had during the inflationary era. It's just in the opposite direction. Now, one pattern that I noticed immediately was how it was a 40-year pattern that played out, 1940 to 1980, 1980 to 2020. So essentially you had interest rates going up, and the lows were higher than previously in the last rate hiking cycle, and then you had the opposite of that on the way down during the MMT era. Now, the thing is, the point in which the bubble would be the biggest, the super bubble would be the biggest that it's ever been, would be right here in 2020 and in 2021, coincidentally, which is where it is as big as it could possibly get. And you know, when you think about long-term positioning yourself for wealth and prosperity, you need to look at long-term things like this, because the thing is, you cannot just blindly buy things thinking that they're going to go up with the recency bias. And even people who are 50, 60 years old right now, they aren't going to be alive for a lot of this era that we're going to be alive for. So you have to be very cautious about that and think about the era that was predominantly their life, which was the MMT era. For some people, they also were alive during the inflation era, so they know what that's like. And funnily enough, it's those people that are sounding the alarm on what's happening right now. So the thing is that's very, very interesting is if we zoom in on what happened in 2020, well, we've had this happen, which is a bottom that has formed. So essentially, rates came down to practically nothing during 2020, and then they flatlined right here, and then you went above this 1.75, which was the previous high during the hiking cycle. So essentially the trend ended. You saw an ending of that trend because now you've got a newer high. So essentially we have reached the bottom, it looks like, from a technical analysis point of view. Now the thing is, these markets, interest rates, are controlled by people. So they are the same sort of patterns that we see in other financial markets. So it's very, very interesting. Another thing that goes into this is I now believe we are heading into this inflation era. And you know what? That could be something that is different. So for example, in Western countries, it could be very, very different to in other countries. And the reason of that is deglobalization that is happening, trade wars that are happening, things that we've seen, wheels that we've seen been set into motion during 2021. So during this inflationary era that we're heading into, you're also going to see a changing world order. There's a great book out by Ray Dalio on the changing world order, and there's also a fantastic video that I'm going to link in the description of this video. It's about an hour long, and I suggest you go and watch it because, again, it's very, very helpful to your long-term prosperity goals and wealth generation and everything like that. So also, you're going to have probably, most probably, a fourth turning happen. And I believe we're in the midst of that right now, the early stages of it. So essentially, you're going to have a changing world order, you're going to have a fourth turning, and all of this is inflationary. This is inflationary stuff. This isn't going to bring down inflation. So you really have to think and just think about where things are going. Look at long-term trajectories. And you know, this is where I see most people kind of making mistakes, in my opinion, because I think people are really just positioning themselves for repeats of the MMT era, which I just think are not possible anymore. We have got to the bottom, to the end of this, and you can just take a look at the charts of inflation, which kind of follow the charts of interest rates, and that is the reason why you're not going to see this continue onwards, because it would end in some sort of civil war or the government being overthrown, because inflation is just as bad as rising debt costs. Some other things that I think are really key to this whole theory is what is happening around the world here in 2022. And really, it's been part of a longer term trend. And think about trade wars. Trade wars were happening before 2020. Trade wars have been happening for a long time. Even trade wars between allies like Canada and the United States have been happening. And those are very inflationary. They lead to a lot of inflation. Then you've got the ESG movement. Again, that is a very inflationary movement. And there are a lot of things in there. You can't just go green in one shot and save the planet. It doesn't work like that. And as we're already starting to see, that is very, very inflationary. The fact that a lot of investment is being directed away from fossil fuels is going to lead to a spike in the price of fossil fuels. And that is going to lead to more inflation. And a lot of that is being driven by the ESG movement. And there's many other things and nuances within that ESG movement. Another thing is deglobalization. You're having the opposite of what we've had happen over the MMT era. You're now getting deglobalization. So the thing is with that, again, it's inflationary, because more and more countries are going to be trying to produce things within their own country or closer to home, and that's going to lead to more expenses, and it takes time to do. It's not something you can just flick a switch and all of a sudden you can start producing everything in your country. So that is going to be a very, very inflationary trend that we are starting to see happen. And then another thing that we've seen turn during this MMT era is birth rates, and they continue to decline across Western countries. Birth rates, again, are going to be inflationary, because we're going to see a lot of people retiring. We're going to not see that many people coming into the new workforce because, quite frankly, people aren't having the children anymore. So population growth is going to become a problem. And you know, it's only so long that countries can paper this over with immigration, for example, because you get to a point that then there's a recession, immigration is cut, or it slows down completely because people don't want to come to a country in a recession, or they don't want to come to a place where they're never going to be able to afford a home, where it's extremely expensive and essentially in a depression, so they don't come anymore. And you end up being able to fill those targets, but you have to keep getting people who are less and less qualified to come to your country. And then that leads to an oversupply of people doing low-skilled jobs and a complete lack of supply of people doing all the high-skilled jobs that you need people to do. Things like doctors, nurses, things like that. Countries like Canada and the UK are losing loads of nurses and doctors, and it's not a good trend moving forward. How are they going to look after the elderly population of boomers, which are now getting to the stage where they need more intensive long-term care and everything like that? So the thing is, guys, I hope this made sense to you, but really, I do believe that we have seen a bottom in interest rates. Now, it remains to be seen whether this is the case. We'll just have to watch and wait and see, and it's going to be something that obviously plays out over the long term, but it's definitely a consideration that I'm going to be taking into account when I structure my long-term portfolio, because the thing is, you do not want to be at the whim positioned for the MMT era and then end up with an inflation era, because the things that worked during the MMT era, like tech stocks, real estate, they don't work very well during the inflation era. So this is incredibly important for people to understand. It's something that I don't see anybody talking about. And quite frankly, it's not something that a lot of people would want to talk about because it goes against what they believe. I mean, think about how much business has been created around this MMT era. If that is ending, the pain that comes with that will be of a depressionary level. And it remains to be seen whether that is going to lead to deflation or inflation. I think it's going to lead to deflation in asset prices and inflation in practically everything else. So anyway, guys, if you enjoyed this video, please like the video. It greatly helps. Please consider subscribing to the channel. Join us on one of the live streams and chime in on the chat there. And I will see you guys in the next video. Take care of yourselves. Peace, guys. Bye-bye.